DNR Division of Forestry for the past 3 years. Prior to her current role, Amanda spent 3 years in several research roles with DNR in both the Division of Forestry and with wildlife research. Amanda's research interests include wildlife forest associations with particular focus on deer forest impacts, as well as ecosystem processes in northern forests. Amanda received her bachelor's in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her master's and PhD in integrated biosciences from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And with that, Amanda, thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kevin. I'm gonna just share my screen here, make sure I get the right one this time.
And as you're getting started, I forgot to say, if people have questions, try to hold them till the end. If you want to drop them, drop them in the chat. That's fine, and we'll just ask them all at the end.
Great. Okay, so now you're just seeing the screen, not my notes, right?
No, we're still seeing the notes.
You're still seeing the notes. Oh my gosh. Well, let me switch, see if I can switch my screen then to that screen.
Yeah, now we've
Sweet.
just got the presentation.
Just the presentation, good. I guess I should just be working off one screen instead of several. So, but okay, we're good. Good to go.
We are good to go.
Great. So hi, thanks everyone. As Kevin mentioned, I'm Amanda McGraw. I'm with the DNR in the Division of Forestry. Prior to that, my background is mostly focused on, as we mentioned, wildlife and wildlife forest associations and interactions. So I'm not a plant nerd. So I'm sure many of you, if not all of you on this meeting, know more about the plants of Wisconsin than I do, but I am a science nerd and definitely a data nerd. So I'll try to talk about this managed old growth silviculture study to the best of my ability, but as you'll soon see, I am not the first person to work on this study, and I will not be the last person to kind of work on this study in a lead role, because it is a long-term research study that we've undertaken with the Wisconsin DNR. And so I'm just going to dive in here to see if my slides will advance. Okay. And I wanted to start with just a brief overview of what is old growth. And many of you probably know the gist of it. They're older forests, you know. A lot of times people try to put an age to those old forests, but really what we found and how the Forest Service actually defines it is that yes, they are old forests, but really it's about the variety of the characteristics of those forests that really make them the old growth that we think of. So bigger trees, accumulations of kind of large dead woody material on the forest floor, a number of different canopy layers instead of just one or two. So really complex structure, both vertically and horizontally in these older forests. They tend to have a really unique species composition and provide some unique ecosystem functions. And so as you can see from the diagram I put here that I really like, that I took from California Cooperative Extension, is showing you really kind of the progression of forest stands in a really general sense. But if you look at the old growth section of this, you can see how complex that forest looks compared to the other kind of younger versions of that forest, if you will. So lots of different layers in that canopy, standing dead wood, which are illustrated here with the dark or black outline trees, and lots of things on the forest floor that have fallen over. So just a lot of structural and species complexity that kind of go into making an old growth forest. But as I mentioned, there is really no age that can be applied across forest types. It's really about those characteristics of those forests that make up old growth. And so no one definition really represents that full diversity of old growth systems. And most definitions, when you have to define an old growth forest, are specific to that forest type. So old growth forests are difficult to define in some instances, and that you can't really slap an age on it and call it old growth. As we just saw, it takes a number of characteristics that contribute to making it a really kind of old growth system that we're interested in. But why are they so important? And I kind of mentioned this on the previous slides, but old growth forests are very complex. And so with that, you get these abundance and complexity and spatial distribution of different features that have important implications for wildlife, in that when you get really diverse structural features, you tend to see a diversity of wildlife that can take advantage of those different features. So you see different unique assemblages of different wildlife living together in these forested systems. We also know that old growth forests are really important for nutrient cycling. Think about nitrogen fixation and things like that, and also for carbon sequestration. There's a lot of biomass that accumulates in these old forests, both in the standing live trees, in the underground structures, and on the structures that end up lying across the forest floors, like that kind of woody debris. Those all hold carbon. So we know that older growth forests are really important for carbon sequestration. They also tend to be like nature's history books. So if you're into dendrochronology, you know that not only can you tell the age of a tree if you cut it down and look at the rings, but you can also tell like what was a really good, let's say, wet year, or that provided a lot of opportunity for growth, or when was there a really dry year and maybe the tree didn't put on a lot of growth that year, or when did a fire move through that system, and how were the trees impacted. And so we can learn a lot from the trees that exist in these old systems back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it really helps with things like understanding the climate hundreds of years ago, and then more recent weather patterns. So that's a really interesting, cool aspect of old growth forests. And they have socioeconomic value. So they are considered sacred by some peoples. And for a lot of us, we really enjoy recreating in old growth forests. They're really enjoyable to look at. There's a diversity of things to look at, including the unique species that you get to see while you're in some of these old growth systems. But given how important they are, we really don't have a lot of old growth systems or forests that remain in Wisconsin. So here is just a very brief overview of the history and current status of our old growth forests in Wisconsin. Before the cutover period of the 1800s and early 1900s, we estimate that about 60 to 70% of our northern Wisconsin forests were either mature, so not quite old growth, but maybe gaining some of those old growth characteristics, or were old growth. And about 66% of those old growth forests in northern Wisconsin pre-cutover were what we would call hemlock hardwood forests, and the remaining 10% in these categories were pine forests. And so here we have a map of what that used to look like, of the early vegetation of Wisconsin, and the darker greens in the northern part are really indicative of where those mature and old growth forests occurred. But now, as of about 2013 and 2014, we estimate that about only 60 to 80,000 acres remain of what we would categorize as old growth forest in Wisconsin. That's not limited to northern Wisconsin, that's total. So of our 17 million forested acres in Wisconsin, there's only about 0.5% that we would categorize as old growth. So a tremendous loss of old growth forests. And as is really probably obvious to everyone, the reason we haven't seen an uptick in old growth forests is simply because it takes a really long time for a forest to become old growth. And so we haven't yet reached that time period for those characteristics to develop into these second growth forests post cutover. And so that leads me to talking about moss. So as I mentioned, it hasn't really quite been long enough for all of our forests to recover from that cutover period and like start growing into those old growth categories yet. Just simply because it takes a long time. And so the MOSS, which is the Managed Old Growth Silviculture Study, is a 50-year study where we wanted to compare several management methods that we think might help us accelerate the development of some of those old growth characteristics while still allowing for us to do some of our kind of timber harvests and other management on these properties. And so basically trying to instill some of those characteristics instead of making them take 150 years, maybe we can accelerate that and make it take like 50 years. And so that's really kind of the impetus of moss is can we accelerate that and really try to build up those characteristics on the landscape. And so moss began actually quite a while ago with what we called phase 1. So in 1994, actually, when an investigation began into some of our remnant old growth forests to evaluate the conditions of those forests throughout Wisconsin and then in the Sylvania wilderness in the UP, and compare those conditions of our remnant old growth forests with unmanaged northern hardwoods and managed northern hardwoods throughout the state. With really the goal of better defining what old growth means for northern hardwoods in Wisconsin. Like we mentioned earlier, it's really forest type specific. And so the goal here is to really hone in the definition just for northern hardwoods and what that means to be old growth in Wisconsin, and then identify those specific structural characteristics within those old growth systems that we think could be achieved through active management. So one thing I want to make note of here is that this began in 1994. I'm going to age myself here. I was 9, so I was not involved from the beginning of this study and certainly won't be involved at the end of it. So I just want to take note of that there because we'll be coming back to that timeline a few different times. But moving on, so over the course of that initial study or phase 1, there were several different characteristics that the scientists really honed in on. One of those was the standing or downed woody debris component of old growth forests. And so what they found is that downed woody debris was highest no matter the diameter class. So this would be the diameter at breast height where you would wrap your arms or a tape around the tree to measure it. So 10 to 40 centimeters or greater than 40 centimeters in these different types of forests. So we really see that in old growth forests, we saw more downed woody debris. So this would be the stuff that's laying on the forest floor compared to the even-aged classes and the uneven-aged managed forests in both northern hardwoods forest types and the hemlock hardwoods forest types. So that's good to know, and probably something we all could have guessed, but is showing up in the data. So that's all really good. And we also found that there's also more larger snags. So there can be more smaller snags in some of our managed forest stands, but when it comes to old growth, we saw more larger dead trees still standing. So an example of that is here. I recognize that this is not a Wisconsin landscape, but it was a really good example of a standing dead tree. So another thing that was recognized in this evaluation of our remnant old growth forests is that there were more larger trees, as we can all guess. They're older forests, the trees get bigger. So more super canopy trees. An example of that is this picture here with a super canopy white pine sticking up above the main canopy of the rest of the forest. But in general, also, we found that across northern hardwoods and hemlock hardwoods, that there are just more larger trees in general in old growth compared to those even-aged or uneven-aged managed stands. Also, as you might imagine, there are more canopy or cavity trees in some of these old growth stands. And so as trees age and grow, we see more opportunity for cavities to develop for a number of different reasons. We also see a loosening of the bark on some trees and other kind of micro features that are more common to older trees that provide really good habitat for some of our wildlife species in the state. So cavity nesting birds, cavity nesting mammals, or smaller mammals like bats that are going to take advantage of cavities or loose bark. So that was all really interesting stuff to see come out of these studies. We know that in older growth forests that forest gaps can occur as a result of natural disturbances like wind throw, or just from tip overs from older trees falling over, fires, etc. And so that kind of just natural disturbance on smaller scales within larger old growth forest complexes provides to the heterogeneity and really that complex structure we were talking about earlier. It also opens up that canopy and so allows for a lot of regeneration, so that next cohort of species to kind of flow into the system. And they also found that wind throw mounds were more common and that these types of structures, so like when the whole tree tips over and brings the roots with us, can provide a lot of microhabitat for a variety of different species, whether they be different small mammals, birds, or even larger mammals if they're crawling in there making little dens. It can also provide a good habitat for seedlings to take advantage of that newly exposed soils. Also, we found from the technical report of phase 1 that these are some of the bird species that reach higher abundances in our old growth forests in Wisconsin. So the birds that are at kind of the top of your screen here, like the winter wren, and some of these others, the black-throated green warbler, Swainson's thrush, are more of our northern associates, you could say, along with the brown creeper. And then the flycatcher, the cerulean warbler, and the hooded warbler are more kind of our southern old growth associates, if you will. So that's all good to know. We have these unique bird assemblages as we might expect. And here we go, finally some plant pictures for you guys. So here are some examples from our technical report from phase 1 of plants that we've observed in some of our older growth forests that have higher importance value in those forests. So for example, squirrel corn, cucumber root, Goldie's fern, ginseng, or dwarf ginseng, and wood sorrel. These aren't exhaustive lists, and I will also point out that in our old growth forests, we don't really have any old growth obligate species like you would think of in the Pacific Northwest with, say, like the northern spotted owl, but we do have species that occur or are more abundant or occur more often in our more mature or older growth forests. And so these are just some examples of some of those species, but not all. Okay, so that was a real quick trip through phase 1. And now I want to try and get into phase 2, which is really kind of where a lot of the field and experimental work was done. And so that's the phase of moss that we're in right now. So really what happened is we took what we learned from phase 1 and we tried to distill down, what were those characteristics that we think we can accelerate development of through management practice. So we took all of that and we used it to really develop the study design and the site criteria for phase 2, We use that to select the study sites and then to determine really the specific objectives of phase two. And so this is the timeline briefly of phase two and things that have occurred until now. So we've gone through study design, site selection, and implementation of the study. And then we've gone through several rounds of data collection, one of which just wrapped up this past summer, and one round that is going to occur this coming summer. So briefly, I want to just touch on some of the objectives of phase two. So really, the main objective was just how can we accelerate the development of old growth characteristics? I've said that a number of times. I'll try and stop repeating myself, but that really is the main objective. But embedded within that, there were 4 main focus areas where specific questions were developed to try and address if we were achieving the main objective through silviculture, what impact that had on the economics of forest management and timber harvest, and what impacts that was having on our forest wildlife. And then in addition to all that, our objective was to continue to do outreach on this study, much like I'm doing tonight. So specifically for focus area 1, which is evaluating through repeated vegetation measurements, are we achieving not only accelerating those old growth characteristics in these stands, but are we also achieving regenerating these stands for future harvest and future extraction? And so really, are we able to grow bigger trees? Are we able to maintain more larger standing dead trees, more larger down woody trees on the landscape, and still be able to like generate timber value from those stands and continue to do that for rotations to come by facilitating regeneration. The next focus area was on the economics of this. So like I said, these are managed stands, and so the goal still is to be able to do some kind of extractive use from these stands. And so it was really, the economic focus is really to determine by trading off potentially, is there a trade-off essentially? If we're going to leave more trees standing, if we're going to leave more dead trees on the ground, is there a cost to the actual timber that we're extracting, either by lower volume or by causing more damage to those trees by felling some and leaving them on the ground, and things like that. So that kind of work is ongoing as well. Our third focus area was really on the wildlife response. And so specific questions at the beginning of phase two were centered on relationships between bird species and vegetation structure. So did we see a response of those bird communities as a result of some of the treatments that went in? We wanted to assess how those assemblages changed as a result of those treatments, determine how flying squirrel home range and habitat use changed because they use old growth forests. In particular, they like to use cavities for nesting and other activities. And then the last wildlife related question is always a question that we have in Wisconsin is, what are the impacts of deer browsing on our ability to regenerate tree species within these stands? And finally, as I mentioned, the fourth focus area was to continue to provide education and outreach opportunities to inform people about old growth forests and old growth characteristics, and the value of those forests to us in Wisconsin and to the wildlife and other things that use those forests. So, for example, tonight, giving this presentation, but this past summer, we took a group of forest professionals out to one of the sites and did a tour and really discussed with them in depth the treatments, discussed with them what they were seeing, how they would manage these stands if they were managing it for old growth. And so that's been a really fun part of getting involved in this work. All right. So we've got our objectives, we've got our um, phase 2 study design coming up here. So here's where we ended up in terms of site selection. We have 3 sites that were chosen for this study, one in the Flambeau State Forest, one in the Northern Highland American Legion State Forest, and one in the Argonne, which is the experimental unit of the Nicolet National Forest. So all in northern hardwood stands, all in northern Wisconsin. The stands that were chosen were generally 70 to 90 years old with no recent history of management, so no entry within about a decade or so of the start of the experiment. And so pretty similar stand types in a similar-ish region of the state. So this project, as you might imagine, got really complex. And so I'll try to distill it down to some of its simpler components. So as I mentioned, 3 sites were chosen for this study. At each site, there were 3 stands. Each stand got a different treatment. So that resulted in 3 replicates of each treatment. One of those replicates was at each site. So the first treatment we have here is what we called the small gaps treatment. So these were 35-foot gaps that were put into the forest canopy. So if you look at these blue ovals, the black kind of squares within them are representing the gaps that were implemented. And then within this stand, some coarse woody debris was added to one side, and to the other side, no coarse woody debris was added. So it's just kind of ambient. Whatever was there was left. There was no removal, but there were also no additions. So that's the difference in the blue shading. And that blue shading and the CWD treatment was consistent across all the different gap treatments. So treatment 2 is where we instituted large gaps. So there's a spattering of 60 and 80-foot gaps in this treatment. This one gets a little more complex in that there was a kind of a nested question in these large gaps, which was there a response if we went in after the gaps were created and removed some of the seedlings and saplings that remained, so cleaned it essentially. So there's the sapling removal, which we call cleaned, and then there's the uncleaned, where the saplings were retained in the gaps. And then there's yet another smaller treatment nested in there where not only were the saplings removed, but we did something called scarification, which is really kind of a scraping of the topsoil to try and facilitate regeneration of some of the lighter seeded species. And then in treatment 3, we have what we call kind of an emulation of windthrow. And so instead of regular shaped gaps, we have some really irregular shaped thinnings or shelter woods that were put in place to kind of emulate the kind of maybe blowdown events you might see in older forests. So really irregular shapes and irregular placement throughout the stands. So pretty complex. And this is my 3rd year in my position. This is our 1st year where we've really gone in and sampled. And so I'm still wrapping my head around all the stuff we did out there, but it's fun to think about, but it gets confusing. So in addition to all those treatments, across all the treatments, regardless of the stand or the site, we put in deer exclosures. So those were fences meant to keep deer out. They're scattered across all treatments. And then there was a creation of standing dead trees through girdling, so cutting through the outer layers of bark to really disrupt water and nutrient flow in the tree and kill it eventually, but make sure that it stays standing. This is essentially a way to create some of those wildlife microhabitats on the sand. So after that design was put in place, then we had to get out and start marking trees. So here you see a forester spray painting these trees. Some of them are being marked for the boundary, some will be marked for harvest, and we use different types of paint to indicate which is which. And then we had to go in and harvest. So that all took place in 2007 and 2008. And I think one stand was harvested in 2008, 2009, just because of some constraints with weather and whatnot and contracts. But pretty much all done on the same year. After that, there was some CWD, so that coarse woody debris or downed woody debris. Those terms are a little bit interchangeable. That was created on half of all the treatments. And so here we have a picture of that just laying on the forest floor. And then this is this other picture here is an example of what that cleaning and scarification looked like. So total removal and disruption of that forest floor, as you can see. And so that got really complex. This is what it looks like mapped, which is, I don't expect anyone to make heads or tails of this map. It is really complex, but it just kind of shows you all the different things that got measured on these sites. So within each of these areas that are outlined, or within each of these circles or little dots, there are measurements being made. And this just is an example of one site with the 3 different stands and the 3 different treatments I mentioned. So we did this at all the different sites. So it's been quite a lot of work to get out there and measure all these things. And some of the data that we collected while we're out on these stands on a regular basis, about every 5 years or so, is really about the snag development, the development of those overstory trees, so their growth, if they're still alive or not, if they're suppressed or not in the canopy. We measure regeneration of seedlings and saplings. We look at herbaceous cover to include some estimates of like pen sedge and other things on the forest floor, as well as measurements of downed woody debris or coarse woody debris, depending on what you like to say. But in addition to those regular measurements, we've also done a lot of other kind of one-off questions, if you will. So there was some sampling to look at carbon sequestration in these stands back in 2011 and 2012. Whoops. There's been some graduate student who's looking at kind of the dynamics of earthworms and deer impacts on regeneration within these stands. Like I mentioned earlier, there have been some measurements on the economic viability of these treatments. There's been some evaluation of the bird community response and also the mammal response that we already briefly mentioned. And so this is kind of like what the plot layouts look like within the different gaps. And so we do, as I mentioned, regeneration measurements of seedlings and saplings, as well as herbaceous layer estimates. And so these plots get laid out somewhat differently depending on the size of the gap, because we need them to be inside gaps and also on the periphery of these gaps to look at like edge effects and center of the plot or center of the gap effects. We also do large tree plots, as I mentioned, to look at tree growth and their placement in the canopy. And so lots of different measurements, lots of really complex plots. And then lastly, the downed woody debris that we estimate a volume for is collected along transects that kind of center out of our tree plots. So walking along the transects and measuring the diameter of the woody browse that crosses the woody debris that crosses the transects. So that's a lot of like diagrams and stuff. So I'm going to get into some pictures of what the actual field work looks like. So this is an example of downed woody debris. So this would be our fine woody debris estimation and on the ground. So this person has laid out a tape that you can see, and they've marked intersection points along there, and they're counting the number of stems that intersect this tape. And so that gives us an estimate of kind of the amount of woody debris on the ground in each of these stands. And as you can see, it can be very, very tedious and very time consuming, but this is also probably providing some really important habitat for a number of different wildlife species in the area, whether it be ground nesting birds, whether it be small mammals. And so this kind of thing is really important to measure. Here's an example of one of our technicians from last summer who was doing a tree plot. So you notice he's looking up. At this point, he's trying to assess that the tree is still alive and where it is in the canopy. So is it up in the upper canopy, or is it kind of suppressed below the main canopy? This picture here is an example of how we set up our regeneration plots. And so you can see there's 4 different corners set up here, and each corner they're going to do a plot to assess the seedling and sapling regeneration within those plots. And so here is a picture of one of those regeneration plots where they're measuring out about 6 feet from this pole. Any seedling or sapling within that radius gets counted, ID'd to species. It gets measured by height or DBH, depending on its size. So DBH would be diameter breast height. And that's, yeah, so just counts of those by species and by height class. And then lastly, of our main kind of vegetation measurements that we do herbaceous species quadrats. And so that we do in a 1 meter frame, which you can see here in the red and white PVC, that gets laid on the ground, and percent cover of different herbaceous groups or species are estimated within that quadrat. Okay, so lots and lots of data, really complex study. So we've been out collecting it since pre-harvest, so since about 2006. We have some pre-harvest estimates of what happened out there, and then we compare those to the response of the forest post-treatment. In the meantime, people have been using this data that we've been collecting and learning from it, like to understand how successful we've been at kind of accelerating those old growth characteristics, and what the response has been by other species that might depend on some of those characteristics. So here's a timeline of when we started accomplishing some of those things. So there was some results about the economics of this treatments that came out in 2008, and I'll touch on in a second. We have a master's student who did her work on the flying squirrel habitat responses, so I'll touch on that, but then also some general technical reports that are available online if anyone is interested. I have information about that at the end of this presentation. And then another of other papers that we'll touch on briefly. So for focus area on economics, I wanted to touch on this. This was presented back in 2008 at the Ecological Society of America meeting. So it's the results of a large-scale experiment assessing the ecological and economic aspects of novel forest management techniques aimed at developing old growth characteristics. What a mouthful. The main takeaway of this study was that by adding coarse woody debris, by leaving snags, and by leaving the largest trees alive, about 12 per hectare on the stand, there were no economic impacts of that. So it didn't decrease the value of the timber that was coming off the stands, which is really good news, because it means we can actually, if you want to think about it this way, have our cake and eat it too. That's what this indicates. We can still do some extractive use from these stands while adding some other value, in this case, old growth characteristics and old growth value to these stands. So that's all really good indications that this is a viable management scenario for us. Okay, and in the next focus area, I want to just talk a little bit about the downed woody debris and the snag density, because these are 2 characteristics of these old growth forests that are pretty easy for us to put on a stand. or maintain on a stand. We've been doing it for a long time. You guys all know that we leave snag trees for harvest um, on a pretty regular basis now. But this is really good information that we were able to glean from this study. So bear with me, these graphs are a little busy, but here we have on the left down woody debris on the, so that's a volume per acre on the y-axis. And then it's showing you really the comparison with the Sylvania wilderness. So that's kind of harkening back to phase 1 with the remnant old growth forests, and showing you the volume of downwoody debris in 2 different diameter classes. So the light green being a pretty small diameter class and the darker green being a larger diameter class. So just larger down trees and smaller down trees. And so comparing the Sylvania to the treatments, so these would be our 3 sites at the 35-foot gaps on the y-axis or the x-axis. And then again, for those larger gaps, so the 60 and 80-foot gaps. The multi, which is that kind of emulation of wind throw that I mentioned. And so you can see that while we're not reaching levels that were measured in Sylvania, we can see that in some instances we are approaching some of those levels, especially with those larger height classes in some of the smaller gap, especially in that smaller gap area of the Argonne. So lots of variability though amongst sites and amongst controls, or the control, I should say. The control I didn't mention yet, but that's just kind of the parts of the stands that we didn't touch, didn't harvest, and we have done similar measurements in those parts of the stands as a comparison to the managed parts of the stands. And then over here we have snag density on the right. So just the number of standing dead trees per acre. And again, by height class. And you can see actually there, we can create a lot of standing dead trees through management. We can exceed those that are occurring naturally at the Sylvania, which is good news. Okay. And so we've actually published a paper on the snag dynamics of these stands. And so some of the takeaways of that paper from pre-treatment until 2010, so about 3 years post-treatment, we weren't really able to maintain or retain as many snags in some of the managed stands. So there's no real difference amongst treatments. No real surprise here, but the bigger snags with less decay lasted longer. The most likely snags to fall were species specific, so basswood and ironwood, and the least likely were yellow birch. And so we have some longevity differences when it comes to different species of tree. And so that might come into consideration in the future if you're trying to create snags that are going to last a long time. We might want to select, say, yellow birch instead of ironwood. But if we want trees that are going to maybe quickly die and fall over and create different types of habitat on the ground, then maybe we leave some girdle some basswood. So those types of considerations are really important when it comes to the goal of the management on these stands. And we also saw that these snags were a couple times more likely to fall over in treatment areas than in control areas. So again, the treatments are the gaps. So you might imagine that there's maybe a little more windfall in those gaps than compared to the forest matrix, which would be our control that was not harvested. So again, telling us, where should we really be leaving those snags if we want them to last longer on the landscape. So again, this is from that study that was published about the snag dynamics. And what we saw is that all of our girdled trees, so these are the trees that we were trying to create into snags, ended up dying within 5 years. So that's all really, really good. That was the intent. And we also saw that the percentage of those trees that were girdled that fell down then increased annually. And so there's not a super long retention time of those standing deadwood. But again, species specific differences. And then lastly, the main takeaway, which was that actively managed stands lost significantly more snags compared to our unmanaged control, and that the net losses increased with the size of the canopy opening. So the larger the gap, the more likely that snag was to fall over. We are in the process of kind of reassessing, these snags in this next summer, and so the intent is to compare with this original study what we're seeing on the stand a number of years later. Okay, so another study that was done focused on the regeneration of seedlings and saplings in these stands, and so the main takeaways of that study after 3 years post-harvest was really that seedling densities increased with gap size. So the larger the gaps, more dense the seedlings. However, what we saw was that this was really just a release of some of our more shade tolerant advanced regeneration species. So mostly sugar maple came in and kind of dominated most of these gaps. We did see that yellow birch were rare in all of the treatments, but they did increase in number in the clean treatments. So that would be where some of that advanced regeneration, like the saplings, were removed, and where we had scarification, so that scraping of the topsoil. So there's some interesting things going on there with what species are really coming in and regenerating when, and how long do they last. And so again, the intent is to kind of revisit this study now that we've got a couple more rounds of data that have been collected. So that includes last summer and the year 10 measurements, but we might wait until year 20 and do a full or a fuller evaluation at that point. But for the main takeaways is that right away we seem to release our advanced regen, and that treatment gaps didn't really result in more diversity of seedlings or saplings. And so at least with really early regeneration, we didn't really achieve our goal of increasing diversity. But again, we're in the midst of tracking this, and we might see that over time, some other species might be coming into play. And so that would be the hope, but we'll see. Okay, a couple more studies to touch on here, and then I'll show more pictures, I promise. There was a thesis done by a master's student at UW-Madison, Ms. Steinhoff, where she looked at a flying squirrel response to these management treatments. And so what she found was that the abundance of these squirrels didn't really change regardless of what the management was on these stands. And their movement didn't really change either. So she had tiny little VHF collars on these critters and ear tags so she could track them. So we know that they didn't really move much more, which is good. Their home ranges were a little smaller in the small gap in the controls, and that's probably just an availability of resources response. And they tended to select areas with higher basal areas, so they wanted those areas with more bigger trees. Also, she found, oops, I advanced on accident, that the probability that these squirrels would change nest trees differed by treatment. And changing nest trees is fairly common for flying squirrels. But she found that the lowest probability of changing nest trees was in that wind throw treatment, and the highest probability of a squirrel changing into multiple nest trees was in the gap treatment. And this is probably to do with having less availability of resources within those wind throw treatments. And so there's just less opportunity to change nest trees because there were fewer cavity trees available. Okay, and so here's kind of, for lack of a better word, one of those one-off studies. So there's a PhD student at the moment at University of Minnesota who's doing some really great work trying to understand the dynamics of earthworms, sedge, and deer on regeneration within these larger gaps that were created. And so you can see here that one of his main takeaways from a chapter of his dissertation, which is in review with ecology, is that there were more worms outside of our exclosure fences. So where the deer could not be, we found more worms. But there were fewer worms in the gaps compared to in the control. And so there's some interesting dynamics going on here with light, with deer access and things like that, that we're really trying to tease apart. And so Sam Reed is doing a good job of that. So he also found that there were more kind of larger soil dwelling earthworms outside of those fences, again, where deer cannot be, and that the gaps had fewer litter dependent earthworms compared to the control. So where there was no management. And so some of this seems a little counterintuitive to me. I'll be interested to see what people think if you have any comments on this later. To think about, having more earthworms outside of fences compared to inside of fences, where we generally see more regen because there are, the deer can't get in there and browse. And so that those dynamics are really interesting, and Sam's doing a really, really good job of trying to think about the biological implications of this and what it really means for forest management, where you have a number of kind of stressors on the system, such as earthworms or deer or invading sedge. All right, so I promised you more pictures, but this is the one of the last timeline slides, and so I just wanted to say that we're still in phase 2. Phase 2 goes to the end, which is the end of 50 years, and that 50-year timeline really starts at the beginning of phase 2, not the beginning of phase 1. And so as we enter into phase 2 continued, we're starting to have some really serious discussions about what the future of moss is in terms of what other types of sampling or what other types of questions we want to answer over time. One of those being the worm deer issues, some browsing issues that haven't been tackled yet, specific to deer, but not including the worms. Some carbon sequestration questions that we haven't fully addressed yet are coming into play right now. And so when that sampling will occur and with whom. So those types of discussions are at the forefront of our minds here at the DNR, in addition to recognizing that our sites are on very different trajectories. So we've seen that our Northern Highlands site tends to be much more simple, have much less regeneration than the Flambeau site or the Argonne experimental forest sites, which are doing quite well. And so we've got this divergence amongst our sites in terms of development. And so we're having discussions about if we should, keep treating these all the same experimentally, or if we should start treating these each as case studies in their own right and really try different tactics to get the Northern Highlands to start developing those old growth characteristics that it's lagging behind on compared to the other two sites. And so there's a lot of interesting discussions that are coming into play within the next few years. I will also point out that I mentioned on one of the first timeline slides that I was 9 when phase 1 began, and that I will retire before phase 2 is over. And so this is a really long-term study. It's very cool. We're going to learn a lot, but we're going to learn a lot after I'm gone, which is interesting to think about. So okay, now I just wanted to show you guys a bunch of pictures here for a few more minutes and then shut up and let you ask questions. So this is an example of one of our exclosure fences where the deer cannot get in. And so you can see all the vegetation growing within it and all the vegetation not growing outside of it. And so one of my questions here in the next few years is really going to be addressing, these deer impacts on in these different treatments. We're also going to be focusing a lot more on reassessing some of the regeneration response and herbaceous species response and composition over time. So here you can see a bunch of Canada thistle in this picture. This was pretty typical immediately after the gaps were created, but what we have noticed is that it tends to fade out over time and other species come in. And so we really want to start kind of understanding the trajectory and the timeline of these events. And we're getting to a point now where we're going to be able to start asking those types of questions with the different cycles of data we've collected. Again, here we've got some really nice trillium coming in. So that's really cool stuff to see out there on the forest. And here's the crew that was out last summer doing all these evaluations. They did a really great job, and they'll be back out again this summer doing some of our more wildlife specific tree measurements. And I wanted to ask you guys, which kind of moonwort is this? So if you have an answer, put it in the chat, or we can talk about it later, but we did see this little guy on the site last summer. And then we also saw a lot of really other cool stuff. If anyone has an ID for that mushroom, can also let me know. We can come back to these later too if you have questions. We saw some cool chicken of the woods. We saw some ghost pipes, so not uncommon out there, but still fun to see. And then I just wanted to end quickly by saying, like, this takes a lot to pull off. And I am not the first principal investigator or lead scientist on this study, and I won't be the last, but I am fourth in a round of principal investigators that have made their way through this study. And so parts of the challenges of these long-term studies is that you do have a fair amount of turnover. And so, making sure things stay on track is a challenge in and of itself, and getting all these new scientists up to speed as we come on is also a challenge. And so that you lose kind of that continuity of knowledge when you have this kind of turnover. And so I think it'll be interesting to see where this study goes under my tenure and then under the tenure of the next scientist who takes over. And with that, I just wanted to stop and say that if you're at all interested, at the end of the presentation, I just provided some additional links to information. So there is a website at the DNR for moss. There are also some other resources at DNR, like the Old Growth Handbook. And then those publications that I mentioned are mostly open source. And so you can look them up and read them yourself if you want. So that's all I had. So I'll stop sharing. If anyone has questions, let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. That was awesome. I think for the questions, why don't we start with people typing them into the chat so we don't have a bunch of people trying to talk over each other. And then if you need to sort of clarify your question as we ask it, you can unmute yourself. But yeah, why don't we start by typing your questions into the chat. Already in the chat, we had some responses to your questions about the identification. So Carol Warden said the mushroom may be scarlet waxy cap. And a couple of us commented that the moonwort is Botrychium angusta segmentum,
All right.
which isn't one of our rarest Botrychium. It's actually one that seems to be fairly resilient to earthworms. So it's
okay.
You certainly don't see them a lot by any stretch, but and definitely not in heavily wormed areas, but they do seem to be hanging around. So that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt Berg asks, just out of curiosity, who did your bird survey work?
I know that Mike Warland was heavily involved with the bird survey work. He was with DNR for a number of years before I came on board, and he's since moved over to Minnesota. And then beyond that, in terms of the crew, I'm not sure who made up the crew, but I know Mike Warland did a lot of that work with those data.
Great. And then Ryan O'Connor asked, would you be willing to provide us with a PDF copy of your presentation?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, if you could maybe email it to me and then we can get it out
Yeah.
to members. And as a reminder, if anyone came in late, we are recording this. We still have to figure out where we're going to post it or how we're going to post it, but we will have this recorded for viewing after the fact. So that's good. Oh, and then Carol Warden said the mushroom ID of Scarlet Waxy Cap was via Emily May King, who's a
Okay.
mycologist.
Thanks, Carol and Emily. And I was supposed to mention to you that we have found Botrychium mormo
Wow.
once. We have one record of it, and no photo that I could find in our our thing. So
Yeah, I'll have to follow up with you on that. That's a special find. So let's see. Carol also asked, do you have a hypothesis about the worm presence disparity? I'm guessing that is in reference to the inside and outside the exclosures. One thing I was wondering that I'll tack onto this question is, can you clarify that, like, what was inside and outside? I've heard of a similar trend with earthworms, but that there were fewer earthworms in the area that the deer couldn't get to compared to outside. But
right.
you were saying the opposite? Is that right?
So Sam, the graduate student, has been finding the opposite. And so I don't have a good hypothesis about why this is taking place. He and I have been discussing that for a while. To me, I've heard what you've heard, Kevin, which is that, or seen what you've seen, which is that you tend to see more outside of the exclosures where the deer can be. And so what he was measuring was more inside the exclosures where the deer cannot be. And I don't know that I have a good explanation for that. Because it seems counterintuitive. Other than, maybe there's just less disturbance to those exclosures in general in terms of other things moving around. And so there's less compaction, more room for the worms to be moving around, even though they should be, facilitating some of that compaction in some instances, maybe. So I don't really know.
Yeah, that's strange.
Mm-hmm.
Or if there's like a vegetation connection, like there was really dense pen sedge outside of the exclosure and that limited.
Right. And so it could be that, it could be like what you just mentioned, that density of pen sedge. And we know we don't know. Sam is examining that pen sedge angle too. So maybe it is that there's really dense vegetation outside that we would consider, not desirable. And so that those three things could be interplaying together and causing that phenomenon. But he's still working on teasing it apart. It's a really interesting problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general that research looking into the connection between worms and deer is really new and no one really fully understands what's going on. So it's interesting. Okay. Sarah asks, can you clarify how many meter squared quadrats you surveyed per treatment area for herbs?
Per treatment area. Well, these are so a lot. I don't know the exact number, but the treatment area, like the entire stand, is 55 acres. So these are really big areas, and so we're talking hundreds of plots. And so I don't know. I don't have the exact number, but in the hundreds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Janet asks, were any jumping worms found on any of your sites?
No jumping worms. No.
Okay. And Ryan O'Connor asks, did all three sites have similar initial vegetation and soils? The highlands tends to have more pines and be more sandy. Do you have thoughts on why the highlands seems to be divergent?
So the stands were similar in terms of forest type, but that's a really good observation. They were somewhat different in soils and habitat type, which is probably contributing to why the Northern Highlands is diverging because of those reasons you said, more piney, more sandy. But, you know, the Highlands seems to be our, when we do research sites that span multiple different areas, the Highlands always seems to be the outlier. So it seems to be different from anywhere else that we are doing research beyond just moss. And so why that is, I'm not sure if it's just truly the soil or the habitat type there on the Highlands that's unique, or if it's some combination of soils and habitat and management legacy. But it's, I would say that it's a high likelihood that the soil type and the habitat type are having a significant impact there on that divergence.
Yeah. Okay, Doug Fields asks, why was it decided to not have a site that had similar treatments but no carbon (parentheses tree) removal?
As in, like, no coarse woody debris removal?
Yeah, Doug, feel free to unmute yourself. And if you could maybe clarify.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
No woody debris removal. No trees at all.
So I don't know exactly why it was decided to have a treatment where you added more coarse woody debris and where you had a site where you just left the coarse woody debris as ambient condition. I don't know, other than they just wanted to add more carbon, because in old growth systems you tend to have more down woody debris on the forest floor, and so the removal was probably deemed not necessary, because these were already somewhat managed stands, and so you would think they would already have like a lower level of coarse woody debris just because they are managed and not old growth.
But all stands had some logging, is that right?
Yep.
All three sites?
All three sites had, yep, all three sites had logging. They had different types of logging, so different size gaps or that wind throw emulation. So, but on one half of that treatment, we added coarse woody debris instead of just leaving it as is. So like from outside the stand, extra coarse woody debris was put on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, Carol asks, in the open areas, were the colonial plants native, or did you find a pattern of to non-native plants in those spots?
So Carol, as far as I know, we have only some non-natives on the Northern Highlands, and that tends to be garlic mustard mostly. But on the Flambeau and the Argonne, I don't know that we have any like invasives in our plots.
We showed the Canada thistle.
Well, yeah, so that's on the Northern Highland, right?
Oh,
So okay, I
sorry.
forgot. On the Northern Highlands, we had Canada thistle, and then we had garlic mustard that came in. But for the remainder, I don't think we had. But I would have to dig back through the data from 2010 to be absolutely sure. But that's my recollection.
Yeah, well, that's good news.
Mhm.
The last question I see in the chat. I'll throw in one more. Do you have a favorite old growth site, whether it's one of the 3 treatment sites or just a site that you get out to in Wisconsin?
So I enjoy the Argonne, mainly I think because I've been there the most. And the few times I've actually made it out to these sites. And Yeah, I really like the argon. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of history there that I enjoy seeing. So
Nice.
yeah.
Okay, one more question. Derek Anderson asks, have you seen any changes to diversity and abundance of herbaceous species?
That's a really good question, and we haven't dug into that yet. So that's like next on my list of things to look into. And as far as I know, no one previously has looked at those changes, and so that's one of the things I really want to dive into in the next few years.
Yeah.
I can't give you a good answer yet. Sorry.
But so would the results of that study, you were saying earlier, there's no obligate old growth species to our knowledge, but like
Mhm.
theoretically, maybe we wouldn't find any obligate old growth herbaceous plants, but we could maybe add to that list of indicator herbaceous species.
There's always that potential. Yeah. So those species that we identify, definitely we could add to the indicators.
Cool.
But I would have to look back through that data yet. And it's just one of those things that such a big study, I haven't got there yet.
Yeah, no worries. Things to look forward to though.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I think there's no more questions in the chat, but I think we'll cut it off there. Thanks again, Amanda. This was a really informative and exciting study. It's cool to see that it's happening, and I think we're all excited to see the results in the future.